Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having us. We're the very last session of the event, and we're delighted to join you. I'd like to introduce the panellists today. We have Ben Lazaro, the CEO of Australian Made Campaign. We have Stuart Rees, the Trade and Investment Commissioner, Austrade. And we also have Kane Fetterplace, the Managing Director of Annex Foods. And what we'd like to talk to you about today is, of course, we know that there's a wealth of opportunity for Australian producers. We know that in the next 5 to 10 years, these opportunities may indeed look different. We've got rising middle class in Asia and other parts of the world. We've got changing consumer preferences with increased buying power, purchasing power. We have new ways of reaching these consumers, these purchasers. We've got, of course, new technology, blockchain technology, new production methods, and so on. The landscape may indeed look different in the next 5 to 10 years. So what we're going to do is understand who our panellists are and the current role that they play in supporting Australian producers, and indeed we have an Australian producer with us. And then we're going to cast our minds forward and look at what are the trends that we can look at now to understand what are the opportunities and what are some of the things we can start doing to capture those. So I'd like to start with Kane, who is indeed an Australian producer. Understand you've been exporting to China for 6 years, also more recently into the US. Tell us a little bit about your business and why international markets are important.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you all. We're an Australian manufacturer. We've got 2 sites here in Melbourne, one in Clayton, one in Moorabbin. We make a lot of muesli bars and snacks, cookies, things like that, very much with a health focus. And we also do a lot of dairy product. One of our customers is Saputo Dairy Australia. So anyone who's seen a bag of Devondale milk powder at any point anywhere in the world, that all comes out of our facility. And we do a lot of work for Mondelez International, but we also own our own brand called Red Tractor, and that's the focus of our export. Very much in whole foods, products like oats and quinoa and chia and flax.
Wonderful, great, thanks. And Stuart, you're recently back from Thailand, I understand. And how was that experience as Trade and Investment Commissioner?
Yeah, that's right. So as of 3 weeks ago, I returned back to Melbourne for a short period of time. I was the Trade Commissioner based in Bangkok for 3 years, and the food and beverage sector was one of the busiest sectors, and across my teams we would work with around about 1,000 companies from Australia each year, helping them position themselves and mostly successfully export into the market. Any types of range of assistance you could possibly imagine, from a quick telephone call just to, quick yes or no, this is possible, to some really quite in-depth research for companies to help them get into the market and understand who the people are and what the barriers are and how to get around them, or how to navigate them. We also covered Laos there. I won't go into too much detail, but that was an interesting protocol-free market at the moment. Small country, lots of problems, quite a good growth rate. We've got the railway coming down, Belt Road project into that country. Really strong and growing tourism sector, albeit from a very small base. But anyway, I'm headed off to India for 4 years as of this Saturday. So under the India engagement strategy of the government, I've been asked to go and establish a new post for the government in Bangalore. So that's what I'm up to.
Wonderful.
You asked why exports. Over the numerous years I've been working across various sectors with exporters, and the work that's been done by the Export Council of Australia. The businesses that export generally, they employ more people, they're more profitable, but they're exposed to new ideas and innovation from having to compete in the international space, and they're not stuck in a small market, in a marketplace which is dominated by a couple of big retailers who are trying to compete for a very price-sensitive consumer in Australia. Spread your risk.
Indeed, good advice.
Hi, Ben Lazaro from the Australian Made Campaign. So I'm I'm lucky enough to look after the organisation that administers and promotes the famous green and gold kangaroo logo that you'll see on many of the products that you buy at your local retail outlets. As I said, we come in, I guess, at the end of a product life cycle when you're trying to promote and market and sell that product. And if we look at it through an export lens, that in most export markets, being recognised as Australia is an advantage and a positive. And so this green and gold kangaroo is, in our view, the best way to convey your Australianness to consumers in markets that will have varying levels of understanding of Australian products and the specifics about them. It's probably important to point out too that from a food perspective, domestically, the Australian-made logo is incorporated into reasonably new food labelling legislation that some of you might be familiar with and are currently putting on your products already for your domestic sales. It's not the simplest process. For domestic sales, you use that logo and mock-up with the percentage bar chart. But in export markets, you're quite free to license with the Australian Made campaign and just simply use that country of origin, green and gold kangaroo, to keep the messaging simple for your overseas audience. So that's where we fit in the scheme of things as far as produce and food exporting.
Wonderful. And so in terms of representing Australia in overseas markets and indeed as an exporter, Kane, how important is Australianness for products and indeed brand Australia?
Well, when you walk around some of the more traditional markets, not the modern sort of sophisticated, supermarkets that we see in Thailand, but when you see other people copying the kangaroos or using old boxes that have got Australian made on it to try and sell inferior products or products from, maybe China or from other places, I mean, that shows you a bit of the value and the trust that the buyers and consumers have in the Australian brand. There are a lot of issues in many countries around the world in terms of the safety of food manufacturing. And we indeed, in Australia have our own problems from time to time, but Australia is generally a very highly regarded system for managing safety. And that's something that, through the efforts of many different organisations and individual exporters have put a lot of effort into over the years, sort of educating consumers in a whole range of different markets about Australia and what an Australian product means. So extraordinarily valuable, but we should not take it for granted, because just as the kangaroo is recognised, or a koala if you want, look, the Japanese products stand out. If I talk about Thailand, Japanese products stand out, US products stand out, New Zealand products stand out. We should never take it for granted that just because it's Australian, it means anything more than those, and I think we've got to continue to invest in the marketing, of the Australian product.
As a brand manufacturer, certainly with Red Tractor, Australia is very important, and we carry the map of Australia as a design on the front of all of our products. In a market like the US, where we've just started to export, it's got a slightly different meaning. I've got an old friend who works over there in retail, and her advice to me earlier this year was still ham up the fact that you've got crocodiles and kangaroos and spiders and snakes and you're really dangerous. So the Crocodile Dundee thing's still is relevant for that market. But in Asia, where we do the majority of our work, we're regarded as clean and green. Huge benefits that come with that. We're also regarded as expensive, and it's important to note that we're regarded as premium and expensive. So you've got to make sure that your products really are good quality. But also important to note, Australia gets you a huge ticket. It opens a number of doors, but it also gets you into a mix with a number of other countries. So, the Kiwis, to be honest, do it better than a smaller market. They have to export. They've got no choice. But markets like Canada, Holland, even like the Ukraine, Germany, there's a range of countries that are also clean and green.
Is that what you find as well, Ben, that there's your role is indeed increasingly competitive to protect brand Australia in our overseas markets?
Yeah, really good points that are made. That we often read articles here in Australia, and you'd be forgiven to think that, if we use China as the example, that the middle class are lining up just to buy Australian products, and of course that's not the case. European products, products from North America, very, very competitive, all demanding a premium and all fighting for similar spaces over there. And so I'd absolutely agree with those comments. And also around the way that Australia's reputation is marketed overseas. I was talking to someone earlier about this, that here we can use the word Australian made, or the words Australian made, and it implies so much, whereas we have to maybe change that when we talk overseas about what actually means high quality, sustainable, clean, green, safe is a very big one, and on it goes. That we have to maybe change the way we communicate, and the brands that are successful over there tend to do that really well, and ably supported by government, whether it's Austrade or other organisations, are all really contributing to how we market brand Australia, which might be a good opportunity then to just touch on the fact that we all might be aware that there's a Brand Australia project happening at government level about how we reinvent our nation brand or strengthen our nation brand to sell Australia better, and not only from an export point of view, but to attract inward investment. And so that's progressing behind the scenes as well. And I think in the next few months, we should see some interesting developments there, all aimed at providing increasing Australia's reputation in those markets to better help the exporters in the room today.
Wonderful. And so there's a really great platform, of course, to leverage. We have a strong brand, we know that we have quality, we genuinely have clean and green, but it is increasingly a competitive place, increasingly competitive market. And so I'm interested, Kane, you mentioned quinoa, that's one that I remember. In terms of recent changes in consumer preferences in emerging markets or around the world, what are you seeing? And can you then also talk a little bit about what you see on the horizon? Let's start to cast our mind forward and what the emerging opportunities are.
Yeah, look, in terms of trends, anyone who's been to an event called Expo West in Anaheim each March, in my experience, that's the biggest healthy, organic, global food event that exists, certainly the most relevant I've found to what happens in our market here and then other trends in Asia. So there's no doubt we're looking healthier, but what does healthier mean? In our instance, very much low sugar, higher protein, better fibre, be it soluble, insoluble, etc., but things that have really got health benefits. And when you truly scratch the surface, there's a real story behind it that's healthy, not it got a 4-star health rating, no offence, it's got hydrogenated oils in it instead of real butter, but that gets you a better health star rating. Things like that, like you've got real stories. And so we're seeing more and more of that. The sugar thing's a really big push, even in places like China that's got a middle class that think anything made in America is healthy, even if it's Cocoa Pops or whatever it might be. So they're probably 20, 30 years behind, but they're rapidly coming. They've only announced, I think, this week, the Chinese government, that the sugar, the fat, etc., they're about to do another piece on for 2030. So, the same trends that you would see here are happening elsewhere. We get a lot of requests we do a lot of oats at export, but we also supplement them functionally with things like a flaxseed flake that's a proprietary product. Quinoa is really growing. If there's anyone here from the government that can help get Australian quinoa into China instead of just the Bolivian stuff, that'd be great. Or Australian chia seeds into China instead of just the Mexican stuff, that'd be great as well. But they're the sort of things that we're looking to grow more and more of.
Okay, great. Please.
Well, Ken, I hope you were watching some of the last session when they were discussing a website where you can lodge your the issues that you have on market access with the Department of Agriculture. The healthy food trends is a really interesting one and for the future, but it means very different things, as you mentioned, in very different countries. One product, might be protein, something. If you're looking to position it in a market, if I'll just draw on ASEAN for a moment, like, say, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, they're actually very quite young populations. Well, the way you position your product in those markets and the way you'd work with your importers, distributors to help market in the country will be very different from a place like Thailand, which has actually got quite an ageing population. So, you've got the elderly there looking to sort of maintain, I suppose, their cognitive nutrition, bone health and strength, etc. Whereas, the youngsters of the other countries all want to look fit and trim, and I suppose don't we all, throughout our lives. But this healthy perception of food is something which is an enormously significant trend that we all need to keep an eye on in how we marketing our products overseas.
And having spent time in the ASEAN region, what are your thoughts on retail infrastructure and in terms of reaching the buyers, reaching consumers, and what should companies that are looking to expand into ASEAN and beyond be mindful of? What trends should they watch and potentially start investing in?
I reckon the biggest trend, or the one thing that has the biggest impact on food businesses being able to sell in any country is the investment that's being made in retail infrastructure. China, of one point, almost, was it 4, 5, 6 billion people, that is not a market unless there's the infrastructure to actually enable those consumers to get to the products. So Thailand has been a good market for many people because it's got probably the most sophisticated retail sector certainly of any in ASEAN. And I've got to say, the quality of shopping experience in Thailand with the major retailers there, and there's probably 5 or 6 in that, surpass anything that you would experience in Australia. Anything in terms of the retail shopping experience. And, I'm heading off to India shortly. I've got to say, that is an emerging market for us, not because so much that, Australia is suddenly, front of mind. It's because there's a lot of money being invested in retail infrastructure so that there are actually physical places now where consumers can go to easily buy the product. And that's occurring throughout ASEAN. So when we're talking about, emerging markets, I think looking at the extent of investment that's occurring into that infrastructure is a pretty good indicator of, I suppose, the rest of the supply chain in terms of getting the product to it there, as to where the opportunities are.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. And Ben, to you, what level of confidence in the future can Australian producers and exporters have in any benefits, of course, with regulatory-related benefits with using Brand Australia?
Sure, there's so many. It can also be quite daunting for exporters here because there's so many different channels to markets and what's the best way to sell my product. More and more consumers are researching before they buy all over the world. So are we telling our brand stories the right way? Are we leveraging our Australianness? How can I get that message out to them, whether I'm doing it on WeChat in China or via another platform in North America? But I guess some of the small ways that we would suggest that Aussie exporters leverage their Australianness is seemingly obvious, that you've got to be upfront and telling them that you're Australian across all the various platforms that you use, whether it's on your packaging, whether it's on your e-commerce facility, whether it's on your Tmall store or whatever it might be. You've got to continue to hammer that story home. We've also gone to the task of registering the brand in multiple international markets. So if our brand is copied or your brand with our logo on it is copied, there is some recourse in those markets. You can imagine if you're copied in an export market, but your brand's not registered there, you've got to chase them via your lawyers from Australia, and good luck with that. So the Australian-made logo now is registered in China, Singapore, South Korea, the USA, India, which is obviously one of the emerging markets. And we've got 5 other Asian countries pending. And in some exciting developments, we've actually got a $5 million commitment from the federal government to promote the Australian-made logo in export markets, which also includes the registration of the logo in the EU, the UK and Canada. So we're extending the legal framework to help protect the brand itself and the brands of those that carry the Australian-made logo. So that, along with some other promotional activities in 2020 and beyond, will hopefully see us be able to add more value to Australian exports moving forward.
Wonderful, great. And so let's cast our mind forward. Let's think forward 5 years from now. Kane, what does your business look like in terms of an international footprint, the types of consumers, consumer preferences, how you're reaching those consumers? What's your sense? As much as you have a crystal ball,
What I hope, or what's written in the strategic plan.
Yeah.
I think it's feasible to think that we could grow our revenue base 4, 5, 10 times. And we've grown it 10 times in the past 5 years. It's just that it came off a much smaller base. But I think it's possible to do that again. I think we'll have more physical assets or people from the company in other markets. At the moment, we use primarily a distributor in each market that we're in, or we go direct to a retailer in Singapore, for example. I think a market like the US has got huge potential if we can manage our way around the food laws, which just are slightly different, and require some different things in terms of claims and packaging, but trying to understand them's really hard. So if there's someone who can help with that, that'd be fantastic for each country. But the US still feels sugar in everything. They think if it's full of sugar but not corn syrup, it's still good. So there's a real scope to grow in that market because they speak the same language, they understand the same language on packaging, so forth. So I'd like to see big growth in that market. But it's a challenging market because of the way, I don't know how many people deal with the US, the dynamics of just how you get paid. You know, I could send a product today from our factory, and if we get paid in the next 17 weeks, we've done really well. So that just brings a completely different challenge because of how it works. And I think we'll pick up markets like Thailand and Vietnam and so forth that'll grow. Indonesia's a great market if it can work out how to let products in without a 2-year registration process. That'd be good as well. I think the Philippines, where we've got some business, will grow. But ultimately, I think all of our growth to hit 10 times will come out of China, like everybody does. But just by getting to more cities. We sell in 10 cities at the moment in about 1,000 stores and online. And I was in a city called Changsha last month to meet a customer up there where at the moment we don't sell any product. And it's a small city south of Shanghai with 8 million people and a bigger Bentley and Maserati dealership than I've ever seen in Melbourne. So, you know, there's clearly money there, but it's not even touched our radar. So
right.
That's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, sure. Has the Diagal, the personal shopper that we've seen rise in recent years, benefited your business?
Great question. Diago is not so relevant in our category because we sell a 500 gram or 1 kilo bag of oats, as an example. And that tends not to fit with the model where you put it in the post and it's not really small and worth $20. I worked at Swiss before I joined the Annex business, so I understand that reasonably well. China was just taking off when I was there, and very much high-value health products are the ones that work best, which is a little bit less us. We're moving quite a lot of organic oats through Diagos in Melbourne because we can't get organic through the door legitimately in China. So it's all going cross-border.
Yeah, sure.
So that's where it works. But, if you go into Hong Kong supermarket at the moment, we sell to DS Groceries direct up there, and we sell a bag of chia seeds at Coles for $10, and they sell it for $7, simply for the fact that we just sell it direct, and they don't take as much margin as Coles.
Right.
And they don't ask for as much.
Right. Yeah.
So I think the best relationships are still going to be direct with retail. We've just been asked in the past 2 months to go direct into one of Alibaba's supermarket chains. They've got a new supermarket called Hamar. We've met with them a number of times over the last 12 months, and we now supply direct. We've just sent our first containers of product up there, which will mean that we can get much more competitive with Eastern European products that are just a lot cheaper.
Right.
So that's the sort of thing I think we'll see more rather than a Daigou in our category.
Right. And indeed, the strength of the Australian-made campaign backing the clean and green and of course, quality and safety benefits of Australian products. Wonderful.
Kay mentioned something important there about wanting to go direct to retailers in different markets. This is where it's really important to have somebody in the country that knows how the different retailers operate, because I know in Thailand, one or two of them might go, import themselves directly. Others just do not want to handle any of that inventory, and they might love your product, but they will nominate somebody to you to be the importer or distributor of that.
Okay, great. So we're casting our mind forward 5 years or 4 years, let's say, Stuart, for you, because by that time you'll be wrapping up your time in India. What for you does success look like in terms of Australian producers' growth in India? And what do you see? Also, I like this element of competition. Of course, it's not just Australian producers that see India as an interesting market. What's your sense, although you're not quite there? What's your sense of competition in the Indian market from other overseas producers?
Yeah, well, at its core, my role is to not just to establish an office, but really open up a whole range of new opportunities for Australian exporters in India. So I'll be focused on those southern states. Out of Bangalore, I think I'm actually looking after our Hyderabad post or sub-post as well, but really grow our presence, grow our team there to provide more services across a range of sectors in India. Look, ultimately, Austrade, and in conjunction with other government departments, have essentially been asked to assist help grow another 10,000 new exporters. Mm-hmm. So my role is to contribute strongly to that and do it in a meaningful way that can be measured.
Okay, great.
And look, one of the ways we are looking to do that is, increase the usefulness of the information that we have up in our heads and that our long-term staff have up in our heads, and get that into some sort of useful and accessible digital format, which is often hard because, of those 1,000 companies that we might have helped with in Bangkok, every company is nuanced in a slightly different way. But we're working through that at the moment, and we've got a couple of products sort of in a beta format at Austrade, and we will continue to work on that and improve to just make accessing our knowledge far easier for exporters.
Wonderful. And just making that segue to technology, Ben, for you, what role can technology play in terms of supporting the quality and safety elements of exporting from Australia?
Yeah, that is a space that our organisation is having a really close look at, and a number of you would have seen some of those traceability and authentication technologies on display here at this event. So we can see, looking ahead, that there is real opportunity to implement some of those traceability systems and authentication systems, and not only implement them, but then have companies with the ability then to act on the findings, because we all know sometimes we're better off not knowing, because once we know our product's being compromised somewhere, then we got to do something about it. And are we resourced to do it? And how do we solve the problem? So I can see in a number of years that these systems will be more widely used, and of course they can all be overlaid with blockchain technology. But we'll also be in a better position to be able to then do something about it and resolve the issues. I think that's something that is going to take some time. But again, it's an exciting development that I think Aussie exporters are going to be in for some interesting times, some real opportunities with the development of those technologies. And also we'd like to see, as I said before, we come in, I guess, at the fun end where you get to market and brand your products, but we're also very conscious, because we deal with thousands of exporters a year, of access to markets. And you mentioned, waiting 2 years to get products registered to get into some of those markets. So we like to see, or we can envisage that those barriers are going to be broken down over the next few years to allow better access of Aussie products into export markets.
I think a really great point that came out from the panel previous to this one was that as an exporter or an aspiring exporter, when those challenges arise and you do encounter, cost and complexity to entering the market, or, first time or even as new potential standards or regulations arise in markets, it's really, really important to be vocal about them. It's really, really important to tell people in government, because the Australian government, if anything, is truly fantastic at responding to those to that knowledge. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yes. I've lost count of how many times we've been informed of an issue that's actually been going on for maybe 2 weeks or a month. There's a container stuck at a port or something, and we've tried everything, and we are sort of almost the last port of call. When in fact we should be the first port of call, because we've got the contacts, whether it be with the FDA, whether it be customs. And, in the embassy, we work with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We've often got an agricultural counsellor there. So we've got a whole team of people that work within the embassy, and there are people within Department of Foreign Affairs based in that embassy whose job it is to work on market access issues and to help resolve them along the way. So, and you can never assume, even though there are protocols in place for a government to inform us if they are making changes to any regulations, they are agreements. But often, and too often, we in the embassy are often amongst the last people to know that there are being changes made. Another irritant. Yeah, and another irritant in the market is also that Australia and, say, Thailand, for example, might come to an agreement on, market access, for product X, Y, Z. Only Thailand won't be all that efficient in actually notifying all of the different agencies and the levels of bureaucrats that are involved in getting that product either off the plane and through the gates, on the road, or off the ship and, out onto the truck and onto the road. Often there's a really poor level of communication there, and that's quite a common occurrence where we might have to go in and just remind people of their own regulations and the steps that they are meant to be following to release that product into the market.
I was almost going to share a nightmare story from a couple of years ago. Our biggest selling product in China is called omega-3 oats, and it's got a flaxseed flake in it that's processed in Western Victoria under a proprietary banner with a farmer that we deal with. And we had 2 containers at a port in Shanghai and 2 on the water when the Chinese government banned flaxseed as a food ingredient overnight 2.5 years ago. We're not 100% sure why they did, but they did. And if you haven't got a Austrade or local government support on the ground, you need to have someone local whom you trust who can help work it through. We managed to get that stock through the port. I won't go into how, but we did. And we found then about 12 months later, the food was put back on as a legal food. It was actually the Canadian government that managed to convince the Chinese government to change the food law again. And that was one where Canada's the biggest exporter of flaxseed into the US. Australia's like number 5 or something. But it was Canada that it was really, really important to, and obviously their producers kicked up a storm and managed to get it back in. So
wonderful.
Yeah, it's important.
Great. Yeah, really important point to highlight, as there are new opportunities in existing markets and new markets. So what I'd love to do is open up the floor for some questions. And do we have any, Chris, on the phone, on the app?
On the app, this is how good this audience is. I actually forgot to remind you that the app is available to log in to the session and ask your question. But this audience, even though it's the last audience of the day, so good. So the question that came through the app, and very welcome to keep asking questions through the app, we also have roving microphones, was around some of the developments around new retail, and you mentioned Hermafresh, and what other sort of, I guess, these emerging markets are sort of racing to new retail innovation, and are there other examples of that in other markets that you've seen, and whether Thailand's got some sophisticated options that can also be useful?
Yeah, look, in our experience, and I know the example was shared by Stuart, a Hermafresh is certainly better than anything in Australia. Like, it is really leading edge in what's available. And not surprisingly, cities like Beijing and Shanghai and Hong Kong have amazing retailers, does Singapore. It's the cities outside of that where they're picking up the very best that exists. And, you know, Hamar's gone from didn't exist 2.5 years ago to 160 stores overnight, 300 within a year is what they're saying. So it's that real premium end, which is where our products from Australia go. We don't finish up in a Vanguard store that there's 4,000 of around the country because our products are just too expensive. And then online's the obvious place into almost any market. But what Alibaba's done and what Amazon are doing, depending on where you are, they're just opening so many doors to give you exposure to where a consumer can buy a product. Our Protein Oats product that we sell in Australia, someone out of Hong Kong exports into America. I know that sounds ridiculous, and I had a complaint over our Facebook recently from a New York consumer who was paying $18 a packet for it, whereas here it's $6. But they'd run out of stock. So
Must love their roads.
yeah, well, it's ridiculous. But it just shows there's scope if you can make that online thing happen,
Yep.
that you don't then need all the infrastructure in place along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, the impact of social media is just huge. In Thailand, you know, as I mentioned, there's this remarkable retail sector, but that has been replicated around ASEAN. And you know, I know when I was last in India a bit over 5 years ago now, you'd struggle to find anything that you would describe as a supermarket around the areas where I was living in Delhi. In fact, it just did not exist. It did not exist. There was a bit of an entrepreneur in Dakar that had studied in Australia, and he was setting up a bit of a handy little supermarket over there. That was a lot better than anything that was in Delhi at the time. But the revolution has occurred, well, you know, and it is well underway. And there are literally billions of dollars being invested in new supermarket infrastructure. It really is amazing. Social media, though, I mean, I reckon if you had an Australian product selling it into Thailand, if you could just match it with some K-pop, you know, jingle, it would sell like hotcakes at the moment. It's such a quirky market.
There you go.
I would echo those thoughts, those comments. I think that there's an abundance of choice, particularly for smaller retailers, smaller brands, which can be challenging. And you mentioned social media is huge in some parts of the world, and very effective way of selling your products, but it also raises a number of challenges. And we've had similar stories with, we got 2,700 licensees, companies that carry the logo on thousands of brands around the world, and we've heard all sorts of stories, good, bad and otherwise. And the takeaway that we have from this is obviously preparation, no matter what retail or channel you go down, and the best first point of contact, in our view, is through the Export Council and Austrade and the people on the ground here who are equipped to provide you with that initial advice about all the what might not seem obvious to brands before they go into an export market, to tick some of those boxes before you even start considering or ask questions of your own brand to get you to start thinking about, well, actually, I haven't thought about that if I'm entering the Indonesian market or whatever it might be. So that's what we've learned from our licensees over the journey.
I certainly think one thing with the marketplaces, the online places, they invest in the logistics as well, which is a key component for these new emerging markets. I think I had a question down the front. Yep.
Hi, thanks for sharing your knowledge. I have a small question for Ben and one for you too in terms of the export market. Ben, what does it mean when I, as a domestic customer, I buy a product, I see the kangaroo, and it says made in Australia with local and imported products, and it doesn't tell me anything? What products are imported and what are the proportions of those products into the, what I'm trying to buy? Because of course we are leveraging everything about the food safety Australia brand. So a little bit of clarity. I lived in Europe as well. So there at least you'd see, okay, imported products from, we bought this from this part, we brought this. So in terms of a customer conscious, so what does it mean in that sense? And from the export market and from the Australian point of view, I understand that China and
one question.
Asian market.
Should we just do Ben answer that one and then we'll go to your next one? That might be easiest for everyone.
Yeah, I will forget instantly. I'll start off by saying I am not government. I don't work for government. But I'll give you my view on it. The food labelling legislation is government run. What you described there, made from locally imported ingredients, should not be occurring on packaging at the moment. So the food labelling legislation requires you to make a country of origin statement. If that is a made in Australia statement, you can use the Australian-made logo and give an indication of the percentage of Australian ingredients in that product. You're quite right. The business does not have to tell you where the rest of the ingredients come from by law. If it's a fully imported product, then they must certainly tell you where that product comes from. So if you're seeing labelling that says made in Australia from locally imported ingredients, for the majority of food products sold in Australia, that is no longer a legal country of origin label to carry.
Do you want to move to your second question? Yeah, thank you.
Just a small question. From the Australian point of view and new markets, I understand the whole focus in Asia and in Asian countries. I want to talk about Latin America. So 650 million people, emerging economy, free trade agreement with Chile, TPP 11, the Pacific Alliance coming up. Why just focusing in China or in Asian market when, free trade agreement is the best vehicle in order to stimulate trade and market? So from the Australian point of view, why you are neglecting that potential market when, we depend already so much on China or in the Asian market that, we should leverage that opportunity. And for you, have you considered, to look at opportunities in the Latin American region, because it's a huge market too?
Stuart, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so from Australia's point of view, we have a presence, in Peru, in Santiago, in Sao Paulo, in Colombo. We have a BDM in Buenos Aires also. It is a far smaller presence, though. We probably think that it's kind of appropriate for the market potential, and I suppose in terms of the food sector, we would probably say, well, we've got enough people there for the demand that we have for our services at the moment. We try to be a bit forward positioned, I suppose, in terms of where we think we need people to help develop the opportunities in different markets, and that's why for many years we've had quite a big investment across China with quite a substantial number of posts there, and why we're now building up the number of posts and investing in more local people as well in the Indian subcontinent particularly. I think You do make a point, though, that there are growing economies in other parts of the world that we perhaps do neglect as our peril. We at Austrade, would like to see businesses diversify and not become too dependent on one big market in particular. We all know what that market is, but we think there are great risks because it is not an open economy, and changes can be made overnight which could have a devastating impact on Australian businesses. So diversify where you can and can afford to.
Great, thanks for the question. Interestingly, we go the other way, so we probably spend $2 million a year buying product from South America. So we're already in that space. But my simple response would be, I haven't met you or someone like you yet, so I'm happy to take your card and talk later, because it comes down to who you know and where you put your time and effort and money. And I'm genuinely, that's how I would approach it. I go, hey, I met someone, let's do a deal. And let's see if we can work something out. Because we think we've got products that are good value that consumers all over the world can take. I met a gentleman through Alibaba who are taking Jack Ma's money and investing it around the world in various investments. So I'll just leave it at that level. And I had a coffee with him in Hong Kong recently, and he said, what are your dreams for Red Tractor, Kane? I said, I'd like to be the number one organic oats brand in Australia and then maybe in China. And he said, is that all? Through the Alibaba ecosystem, why can't we take over the whole world? So I think that there are people out there who can help with that. So A, I'm interested in that. But B, if I'm going to hop on one more plane next year and go one more place, to be honest, I'd probably go back to Shanghai again, because I still think I get more bang for buck going there again, or to Chongqing or Chengdu or somewhere else, than jumping on a plane to Chile or Argentina or wherever it is. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but that's just my instinct.
Well, you heard it here first. Red Tractor is taking over the world. So if we got nothing else from that, we have that. Were there any other questions from the floor? I know it's late in the day. Everyone's getting a little bit tired. We're approaching our end time anyway. So with that in mind, I might just ask each of our final panellists to share just one final remark that they can leave you with as you go into these emerging markets and begin or continue your export journey.
For those wanting to export, my only simple advice is go and go and go again. I learnt very early, I got some fantastic feedback from someone who I've never traded with. I went with the Victorian government on a trade mission in 2013, and we toured around a number of cities, and I met a distributor in Shenzhen. And then about 3 months later, I went back with my colleague who's here this week, Hong, who's Chinese, so I couldn't do it without him. And we went back to this particular distributor, and I walked in the door to his office 3 months after seeing him, and he said, "Oh, you're back." To which I responded, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Australians don't come back. You come here one time, think you get rich, you don't come back. The Kiwis come back, the Canadians come back, the Germans come back, you don't come back." And really straight down, the middle feedback. And so we've been back a lot. And it's the reason I think now that an Alibaba or someone approaches us and says we want to do something, because we just keep going back and we understand the market now. So that had been my one bit of advice.
Very good advice.
Two anecdotes now, because if there was ever something that irritated my staff in Bangkok, would be that they would come away having delivered a tailored program where we've delivered meetings with pre-qualified importers and distributors that are interested in that product. A few weeks later, my business development manager would be coming to me, you know what, they could have done the deal, but they've got to, they just never come back. They never came back. They never got on the email. They never came back. And so they lost the deal, that was my second point. Look, for anybody that's not yet exporting, the amount of support that's available these days is just tremendous. You've got here Global Victoria, the Victorian government, that is prepared to invest an awful lot of money in people and in events and in taking trade missions to a number of countries around the world where they've invested in infrastructure and people to provide support. You've got Austrade with our network of 80-something offices around the world. You know, in Thailand, one of my business development managers in the food and beverage scene has been working in that sector for 20 years, and there is not one person that is worthwhile knowing that she doesn't know in that, and doesn't know how they think and what they react to, and isn't able to sit with you as you drive to those meetings and tell you, this person, this is what he will be reacting to, this is how he will run the meeting, and provide that just absolutely gold advice on it. We've got the free trade agreements across a whole number of countries, and that is looking like it's going to improve. You've got to understand how to utilise the FTAs and get the benefits from them, the benefits for you and for the importer distributor. It works both ways. There is a little bit of effort involved in that. And we've got coming down the track potentially benefits through the RCEP agreement, which is currently a priority for the government to try and get across the line by the end of the year also. So things are being made easier for you. You've just really got to pick up the phone and speak to Austrade or speak to the Victorian government and say, hey, this is what I do, what do you reckon?
Ben?
I would simply encourage exporters to leverage their Australianness and all the attributes that go along with it, whether it's safety, high quality, clean, green. As I said, we come in at that marketing and branding effort and use those attributes to tell your story. And of course, the best way to do that is by using the Australian-made logo. It's recognised, it's trusted, and it works both domestically and overseas. So that'd be my advice.
Great.
Wonderful. Well, firstly, I want to thank you as an audience for joining us. The last session on the last day, let's be honest, it's not easy to find that energy and motivation to come here. But really, I want you to join in me in thanking Sophie, Ben, Stuart and Kane for providing their time and stories today. So thank you.